types and subcontracts. And I think Fran has already shared her screen. So Fran, you can just get started when you're ready.
All right. So this is part two of a three-part series. And today we're going to talk about format guidance, forms and files, some budget type information, what to do with subcontracts if you have them, and some of the common problems or errors that we see. So I've touched on this before, but I want to go through it again. When we're talking about guidance, you have to realize that you need more than one set of guidelines to be able to do your proposal. So you've got to have some basic understanding of the federal guidelines, like the cost principles, the NIH general guidance, and then the specific program that you want to submit to. And then if that has been impacted by any NIH notices, you also have to be aware that you could be impacted by state and local information. For example, if you've got a state agency involved, or if you have to use the rate agreement that we negotiate locally with the university. There is a lot of information available on NIH's website on using the guidelines in different forms and formats and examples, and that's available on this link here. I also want to mention, if you've ever looked at the NIH general guidelines, which we'll talk some more about in a minute, they're really hard to understand because they merge several different versions into one set of guidelines. So when you go to look at it, you have some general information, and then you have additional boxes that have information related to things like SBIR, STIR, training, and fellowship submissions. And so to make it a little easier to understand, they made extracted versions for each of these different types of submissions. So if you're primarily interested in research related submissions, you can go to this link and you can pull down a version that doesn't have all those little extra side notes on fellowships and training and things like that. So it makes it a lot easier to understand. So the general guidelines that NIH uses is called the SF424 Research and Related Application Package. And normally it's called SF424 R&R, and then forms, and then an alpha character. And so every couple of years, they'll change an alpha character. And when they go through these series swaps, there'll be an overlap period, usually for a few months, where you have to watch your application packages and your solicitations to make sure that you're using the right version, because you could have some that fall under the old format and you could have some that fall under the new one. So the current one that we're using was released in October the 16th, 2020. But NIH is one of the unusual federal agencies in that their general guideline isn't static. It's not just published and it sits untouched. So they'll put out changes 2 to 3 times a year. So if you go in and you pull a copy of these guidelines off, and then a year later to decide you want to use them for a submission, you're liable to miss some important information. So you want to make sure that you go in and pull a current version just before you get ready to start doing the final work on your submission. They also have things called notices that come out that can provide either updates to the general solicitation or may provide information that affects everything. For example, a notice that normally comes out every year or two is where they issue an update to the salary cap. So if you have executive level salary, you're not allowed to claim more than a certain amount on an NIH proposal. So just make sure that you're using the current copy. And I also mentioned on the notices, they also have a type of notice called the Notice of Special Interest, or a NOSI. And usually a NOSI won't change how you're submitting something, but it'll add information like where you should put a note that you want to apply for a NOSI. And so it'll have you add some information somewhere on the 424 cover or an additional attachment that you put with the submission contents. So I wanted to show you, this is a parent R01, which is a general announcement that comes out that you can submit for. And I wanted to show these related notices. So these are notices that NIH has put out that have impact on this particular solicitation. So one of the first things you want to do when you're pulling a specific solicitation that you're going to submit to is look through the notices that have been posted on it, because they expect you to look through these and see if any of these apply to you or are going to impact the type of proposal that you're going to be submitting or the work that you're interested in doing. And these can get quite long. I've seen them go as many as 20 to 30 long as the parents get older and older. So you at least want to take a quick scan and make sure, especially to know if there's any notices of special interest, because usually a notice of special interest means that there's set aside funds for those. And so it might increase your funding chances if your research is going to naturally fall in something that might um, cross paths with that notice of special interest that they're putting out. So now we're going to go through some of the common forms and files that you'll see. So the 424 cover form, your proposal development person in ORS will complete this form, and it is certified or signed upon submission electronically. It uses information that you give us on the information sheet unless you tell us that something is different. So like if your title changes, then you let us know that the titles changes, then your PDS goes back in and changes that. If we have time as we're loading documents for you, your PDS should be able to give you a print copy so you can see what's actually loaded on that form and let them know if there's any changes that are needed. Um, if you work in the Stevenson Life Sciences building, you might want to make sure and check your address if that's the address that you want to use as your contact address, because most of the time those are pulling in directly from PeopleSoft. And so they're however you were loaded in PeopleSoft, which was usually in your department on the main campus. And be sure to check your title, especially if it's possibly changed. If you have a cover letter that is going to be attached, it is also attached to the R&R cover page. If you haven't done a submission in a couple of years, last year they came out with a change that they no longer let you communicate your assignment preferences on a cover letter. There's a special form for that now. And they had an optional period where you could do either, and they've done away with that now. And so they won't even acknowledge that you put a cover letter if it was only for assignment preferences for your review committee. Then there's the 398 cover page supplemental form. PHS stands for Public Health Services. We also complete this form over in ORS for you. At some point in the process, your PDS will usually send you a list of questions. And so between that list of questions and information that was on your information sheet, that's how all these forms are filled out. If you answered yes to vertebrate animals in the other project information form, then you'll have questions to answer on this form based on euthanasia. And they'll ask if you have any anticipated program income. So program income is where you're going to be generating funds related to the research that you're doing. For example, if you were going to put on a workshop and you were going to charge for people to attend that workshop, if you made any income off of that, then NIH would expect you to roll that back in to the research that's being done on this particular project or to talk with them about it. There's also questions about embryonic stem cell usage. And if you've got, if it's a renewal type of submission and you're going to be changing the PI or the institution, or you need to declare inventions or patents. Those are the types of questions that are on this supplemental form. Then you have your project performance site form. Your PDS also completes this form. We primarily use the data that comes in that's tied to your information in PeopleSoft. So if you want that changed to like a specific laboratory location or something, then you need to let us know what you want it changed to. Many times your subcontracts or collaborators or consultants, people that you've identified as key persons, you as the PI may wish to indicate that there is work occurring at other different locations. And so If you do, then you have to help provide that information to us because it's not resident normally in our systems that we can pull from. And your PDS can send you a form to fill out that has all those blocks for the types of information that we need. We do need the congressional district, the county, and the zip plus 4. The zip plus 4 is required on all the form entries, and it won't let us bypass it. It causes an error. Um, while many times, especially subcontracts are loaded as another performance site, there's no requirement. So it's entirely up to the PI. We've been told that the primary purpose of this form is so that NIH can get a record of the different sites that are funded congressionally related to the funds that they're dispersing. So they can go back to Congress and say, we provided funds to these congressional districts. So that's what this form is used for, at least from what we've been told. Your R&R other project information form. This form has a part that has questions. So we'll go through those and fill them out either using the information sheet or questions that your PDS sends to you. And then it also has a section where it asks for files. And we're going to go through each of those files in a little bit. So some of the questions that it asks are things like, will your research involve environmental impact? Is there going to be international work or collaborators? Do you have human subjects or vertebrate animals that are involved? And depending on how you answer these questions, it may drive the need for other files being loaded later. For example, if you indicated that you were going to travel for an international conference or you had an international collaborator, then you would have to provide a foreign justification as part of your submission documents. So now we're going to go into each of these little subfiles and talk a little bit about each of them. So your project summary abstract is supposed to be releasable to the public, so no proprietary or confidential information. Usually it's 30 lines, and this isn't sentences, it's actual lines of text that they count. So you can't have more than 30. They want it to be in a first person narrative and talk about your long-term objectives and specific aims and the key focus in the mission relationship that this work has. So watch your line counts on this one. The project narrative is just the opposite. It is 3 sentences and they count the periods. And I've seen some really long sentences here. You want to talk about the relevance of this research to public health, and this also has to be releasable to the public. So if you get selected for funding, normally the abstract and this narrative are 2 of the things that are released for publicity statements as they're talking about how they're expending their award funds. Your bibliography and references cited are required on all submissions unless it's noted specifically in the solicitation that it's not supposed to be attached. And you can cite the references in your in any length or as needed, but you're supposed to be as concise as possible. You can include URLs or PubMed ID numbers along with your full references. And basically you should include any reference that you have used in the research plan or human subjects and clinical trials information, basically anything in the proposal where you're citing information, you want to go back and reference it in your bibliography. Other attachments can also be added on this form. And so the things that you would put here would be like the foreign justification if you answered yes back on having foreign involvement. There is a specific information in the general guidelines about what can be included here and what can't, or you might get specific instructions in the solicitation. You want to be very careful though, and don't just assume that you can put something here because they look at it, they look at both attachment areas that are in these forms very closely to make sure that you're not trying to circumvent page limitations. And so if they can look at what you have added and say, oh, well, they should have included this in the research strategy, they could hold it against you and completely discount you either from review, or they'll just take everything that's in those other attachments out and they won't send it to the review committee. Your facilities and other resources, this is what you have on hand to do the work. And if you have multiple sites involved, like if you've got subcontracts that are doing work, then you also want to include their information. So that you want to kind of address things that are going to help lead you to be successful, or things that are unique that might make you stand out compared to other people that could be submitting to the same solicitation. If you're an early stage investigator, you want to also make sure that you describe the institutional investment that's been made or will be made in your success as a PI. For example, special classes or training that you're going to have, enrichment programs, and things like that. If you've got protected time for research. So those are things that you want to mention. And I believe I mentioned this in the last presentation, but I'll mention it again. If you're an early stage investigator, make sure that your profile in ERA Commons says that, because that's where NIH goes back to pull who the early stage investigators are. And many times when they do solicitations, they have special funds set aside to fund new investigators, so that they're helping the early career people progress and get some experience in doing research. Another file that is in this area is equipment. Again, this is what you have on hand or readily available. They don't want a laundry list of everything that you have in a lab or in all the labs around you. They want the things that are going to be applicable to the research that you're doing. But don't forget that it's not just your lab. If there are assets close to OU, for example, OMRF or HSC, that would help you do the work, and you can make arrangements with those organizations, then you can list those as assets that you've got available to you to use in the local community. The R&R Senior Key Personnel Profile Form, this is where you put the information for all of your key personnel. You want to think about who these people are, because it can have impact on you later. So they're people that have a substantial, meaningful contribution to accomplishing the objectives of what the research is that you're trying to get done. If these people are at OU, most of them, we can pull their information in directly from Cayuse. And so all you need to do is let us know what role they're going to have. If the person's not at OU, for example, they're at HSC or the University of Ohio, then you have to give us their information, like their full address, their title, their zip+4, their phone, and their email. And we can send you a template that has blanks where you can fill in this information. You have to have an eCommons ID if you're a PI, or anyone who is designated as a PI. So NIH is kind of unusual in that they don't really recognize the co-PI designation. You're either the lead PI or you're another PI. Now, you can be a co-investigator or a collaborator or have another role, but anyone who's designated as a PI has to have an eCommons ID. And if you're the lead PI and you make someone else another PI, for example, if you've got a subcontract and you want that person to have a PI capacity, then you have to do what's called a multiple PI management plan. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. You need to make sure that your profile matches the role that you have. So for example, when we had this happen, we had a PI who had a person at a company that they also wanted to list as a PI. And so we did, and they had an ERA Commons ID. Unfortunately, their profile showed them as, I think, a research scientist, and not as a PI. And so we didn't get an error generated on that until it was processing into NIH after the deadline, so 2 or 3 days after the deadline. And unfortunately, that completely eliminated the whole proposal from consideration at the review panel. So I mentioned before, zip+4 is always required. all of the people that you designate as senior or key personnel have to provide a biosketch file, and you have to make sure everybody's using the current format. Right now, we have two acceptable formats as far as NIH is concerned. Both of them say um, 2023 in the upper right hand corner. However, uh, in May, a change came out where they were going to change the form. And in June, they came out and said they were going to delay the enaction of this until January 22. But they still expect you to provide the correct information, although they won't reject your proposal until January 22 comes and they get the submissions after that point. At submission stage, you don't need a current and pending or other support file. But if you get picked for just in time, which means they're considering you for award, then you have to provide the current and pending or other support forms for all of the senior and key personnel. So um, it's a lot of information that might have to be gathered for all the people that you have listed. So that's one of the things that you might make you consider if you just have someone who's on an advisory panel. Do you want to consider them as senior personnel or not, and key personnel or not? So the PHS 398 research plan, that doesn't have any form entries on it at all. It is all files from the PI that get loaded. So the first option to load a file is called an introduction file. It's only used if you're doing a resubmission or a revision, and it's can only be 1 page long. And what it is you're just summarizing how you're responding to the comments that were made by the review panel from the last time your proposal was reviewed. A specific aims file is always required unless the solicitation says otherwise. It's always 1 page unless the solicitation says otherwise. And this is where you list the specific objectives and the goals and the impact of the research that you're doing. Then you have your research strategy. The page length varies by the type of solicitation that you're doing. So for example, if you're doing an R01, those are normally 12 pages. If you're doing an R03 or an R21, those are usually 6. You can go to this link and you can check the page limits. If it doesn't come out and say exactly in this specific solicitation how many pages you have, then it refers back to this table where you can check the type of solicitation and it'll tell you how many pages. So in this, you're going to talk about your strategy, your methodology, and analysis. Um, you should organize it into sections and label the sections so that it's easy for the reviewers to find the information. And it's, I wouldn't say always common, but um, it's not uncommon that the specific guidance that the solicitation that you're going for may give you additional information in this area that they want to see you cover. So unless you're told otherwise, the sections that you're supposed to include are significance, innovation, and approach. The significance is the importance of the problem or critical barriers that you're hoping to address or overcome uh, in the research that you're doing. The innovation is looking at how is this going to shift the current research paradigms, or are you going to describe something novel in your concept or approach or methodologies, or come up with different instrumentation. What makes your proposal be innovative compared to everyone else? Then your approach. What is your overall strategy and methodology on how you're going to accomplish this research? Um, you want to talk also about the data that's going to be collected and analyzed, safety concerns that might be involved with the research that you're doing, and potential problems or what you'll do if you don't get the results that you expect to see. Then you have your vertebrate animal file. So this is needed if you answered yes to vertebrate animals on the other project information form. You're supposed to address 3 specific criteria. And this there's several pages related to this in the general instructions. So you can't just say, yes, I have vertebrate animals involved, they're mice, and this is what I'm going to do with them. They want to see you address this in specific areas. Besides these three criteria, there are also two other items that you have to address, and that is when and how the animals are expected to be used, especially if you've got collaborating sites, and if the plans have not been finalized. There's an NIH worksheet for animals that's on their links that they have for the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. And then there's a policy statement on the requirements that you have to meet for handling animals. So if you haven't looked at those before, you might want to look at them before you start trying to address what they want to see in those three criteria. Consortium contractual arrangements. This is where you're supposed to do an explanation for the programmatic, fiscal, and administrative arrangements between OU and who else you have that might be working on the proposal, like other subcontracts, um, and why you picked that particular one to work with, or why you have them at all. Why couldn't you do all the work yourself? Uh, Normally, we load an official subcontract letter or a subrecipient form with this file or in this location. There are many times that the PIs don't give us this first file that talks about the programmatic and fiscal arrangements. And so all we have to load is the subcontract letter or form. I don't know of any PI that's ever got a bad comment back about only having the subcontract letters, but I can tell you that the most correct file to load is one that includes this first pocket of information and then includes the actual subcontract letter or form. On letters of support, those all have to be combined into one PDF. They don't want to see those in an appendix. They should address the support of the consortium participants or collaborators um, for the particular proposal, what they're going to be providing. Um, there is a lot of information on NIH's website and in the actual guidance that talks about what can and cannot be included in these letters. Too much for me to list on this slide. So I would advise you, if you think you're going to have letters of support, to go and look at some of the information that they have there, because it's about like a page and a half or more of information. They don't want to see bio sketches with letters of support from consultants. This used to be something that was very common a few years ago. If you had a consultant, you would normally load the bio sketch here. Um, that's no longer. If you want the bio sketch for whoever is going to be your consultant to show, then you have to load them as a senior key personnel. The only exception to that is on the STTR, SBIR applications, and they have specific information on their letters of support. The resource sharing plan, most of the time the guidance will say that this is optional, but you'll see other places on NIH's website and in the general guidelines where it talks about it being recommended, or it may require it for just the data sharing component if you don't have model organisms. So we recommend that even if it says it's optional, to go ahead and include it, because you can put the information here on your data sharing and not put that in your research strategy. And that gives you more space to talk about other things in your research strategy because your data sharing is covered here. It is not optional if you're going to be asking for more than 500,000 in direct cost, or if you're going to be using model organisms or doing genomic data sharing. So some other information about the research plan. Make sure you look at the solicitation to see if it has special restrictions on the appendix, because this is very common, and they'll usually say that none are allowed. If they do allow them, usually you're limited to 10 PDF attachments. So if you've got more than 10, then you have to combine the ones that are left into one big attachment that you put as attachment 10. They recommend that the file names be descriptive of the content for what you load here. And if you've got a lot of information, that you have some type of a table of contents or a summary sheet that you include with the appendixes. I mentioned before, this is the second place where appendixes can be loaded, and these are looked at closely to make sure that you're not circumventing page limits. So be sure and check the general guidelines and see what they allow and don't allow to be added as an attachment here. An example of some things that are allowed would be, for example, if you were going to go out and do a study and you had a list of survey questions you were going to ask someone, then you could load a copy of that survey tool as one of the attachments here. So that would be allowed. Human subjects and clinical trials information. This is a separate tab. If you did a submission a year or two ago, make sure you go back in and look at the information again, because they made a lot of changes to this area in the most recent version of the general guidelines that came out. If you're not sure if you've got human subjects or not, there is a tool that you can use where it asks you some questions online at NIH, where they kind of try and give you an ideal whether they think you actually have human subjects involved or not. It's very important to find this out early, because that can affect the solicitation that you're doing, because a lot of solicitations will say no clinical trials, and others will say that the clinical trials are going to be done or are optional. You have to complete the other projects information form first, where it asks you, like, do you have human subjects involved? Do you have IRB approval yet or not? Do you have an exemption? Because those answers carry over into other parts of this form. If you answer that no human subject research is being done, it may still have some applicable questions on here. For example, are you using non-identifiable data related to human subjects, where you still may have to provide a file or fill out a question. So you have to be sure and look at this form closely. If you answer yes to our human subjects involved on the other project information form, then you'll have many additional files that are needed with this clinical trials, human subjects and clinical trials form. It'll ask you for study records, and it'll ask you information about who is enrolled or going to be enrolled to participate in the study. You have to use unique names if you have more than one study. It won't let you load the same name twice. And we've also found that this is very picky on file name length. So you want to try and have short file names. Don't assume that you don't have to provide any files. If you provide a negative response, you need to read all of the sections on this form to find out if that's the case or not. And I mentioned before about the links on that NIH had a lot of information on their website. Here is the link that's going to give you a lot of information related to the human subjects and the clinical trials information. So some optional or unusual forms or files. So the cover letter, I kind of touched on before. It is usually optional unless your specific solicitation asks you to address something. It's not uncommon, if you're going to respond to a notice of special interest, that you might be required to have a cover letter that addresses something related to that notice of special interest. They no longer want to see them requesting the assignment for the review panel. Your progress report publication list, that file is only needed if you're doing a renewal application, because they want to see if you had publications as a result of the research that they already funded. If your application package comes in with an SFLLL, which is a lobbying activities form, if it's needed to be completed, then the PDS will complete it for you. Sometimes that varies by the specific solicitation. Well, they'll require it even if we don't do lobbying. A select agent research file. So there isn't a page limit for this file, but you only have to do it if your proposal involves select agents. And so select agents are things like hazardous biological things and toxins like anthrax and things like that. There is a list that you can go to um, on NIH's website that gives you a big list of things that they consider these biological agents and toxins. And there's also some that are common enough for laboratories that they are excluded. And so you might think, oh, well, I'm working with this. And so it's a select agent. But if you went to the website and looked, it might be on the list of excluded agents, and which would mean you don't need the form. If you do need the form, it's not just, yeah, I'm using this in my research. You have to identify the information in 3 points. You've got to identify the agent, you've got to give the registration status and the entities were used, and you've got to provide a description of the facilities. And for each of these, there's specific information that they want to see. I mentioned before, if you are the lead PI and you are going to designate other people also as lead PIs, um, you have to make sure that they have their ERA Commons ID, and you have to provide a file that says why you think it's multiple PI, how you're organized, who makes what decisions on what, how you've divided the budget, um, who's responsible for what technical and scientific objectives and things. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind if you do a multiple PI, as far as NIH is concerned, everyone who's a multiple PI has equal weight and responsibility as the lead PI. So let's say you have a lead PI at the University of Timbuktu and they decide that they think the budget should be shifted in a certain way. And so they call NIH and say, we want to make these changes. NIH is going to accept it from them because they are considered a PI of equal weight as the lead PI. So if you don't want that to happen, then you should designate other people who would normally be co-PIs. You should call them a co-investigator. The PHS assignment request form is a form that you fill out that tells who you want the study section to be for your proposal. And you can list more than one. So if you think your proposal might uh, should be looked at by the program officers for more than one study section, you can list it here. It's an optional form most of the time. Once in a while, a specific solicitation will say to include it. However, we would recommend that you provide one because this is the only chance that you get to direct where your proposal is going to be considered. So if you don't fill this out, then the person who's processing your application when it comes in will make the decision on which program officers or what study sections your proposal is going to be routed to. You have the option of completing what parts of this file you want. So for example, it asks for key terms or words. You can fill that out if you want to. If you don't, you don't have to. You can just fill out the study section information. It asks for information about people that you would not want to be on your review panel. You can fill that out if you want to. If you do choose to fill it out, we recommend that you don't go into a big story about why you and this other PI don't get along and shouldn't be looking at each other's stuff. Just say that there's professional differences or conflicting research and let it go with that. Your authentication of key biological and or chemical resources. So this is where you describe how you're ensuring the quality of the biological and chemical resources that you're using in your studies. Um, about 2 or 3 years ago, a buzzword that came out was rigor and reproducibility. There's a lot of information about that in the general instructions. The problem that they were having would be one set of researchers using a specific type of biological and chemical resources would get a certain result in their research. And then someone else would come along and try and replicate that study, and they would get completely different results. And so they went back and they were doing some comparisons, and they felt like there was a weakness in not having information available on the resources that were being used. So if you're using NIH funds, um, whether or not you're using NIH funds, if you're using what you would consider key biological chemical resources, then you need to talk about them here. They recommend that one page be used, but it's not limited to that. You can use more pages than that. I thought it was interesting. We actually had a PI a few years ago that talked about their mice, like where they purchased their mice from and their gene strains and stuff related to the mice. And one of the review comments they got back from the reviewer was that they felt like their mice weren't high enough quality. Um, Another note that we wanted to make was on interactive forms. So it's not uncommon that a solicitation may have a link to an interactive form, or that some of the forms that you're downloading and using um, could have an interactive link. And many times you can tell this because um, they have special shading on them, or you can still type in them even after they're saved. A lot of times those will generate an error or cause an issue um, when they're uploaded. So if that happens, then we have to save it as a PDF to load. There are occasions, though, that they want an interactive form loaded, and they'll say that in the specific solicitation, usually where the link is for you to pull that form down. So you want to be careful that you don't kill the interactive nature of it if it's specifically stated in the solicitation that they want it to be there. So now we get into the fun part of determining what your budget type is going to be. So NIH has two types of budget. They have what's called the R&R budget form, or the detailed budget, and then they also have the PHS 398 modular budget. And while an application may have both of these forms available to use, you will never use both. You have to pick which one that suits what it is that you're doing or the solicitation. There are some times that the solicitation will come out and tell you exactly that you have to use the modular or you have to use detailed. I've seen one or two that actually had another form that they wanted you to use. Um, Usually, which form you're going to use, if it doesn't tell you in the solicitation, is going to be determined by the direct cost from the whole project. So if it's greater than $250,000 of direct cost in the budget period, then you're going to be using a detailed budget. If it's less than $250,000 in direct cost in the budget period, then you're going to be using a modular. And if you have subcontracts, normally on a subcontract, we consider the whole cost of the subcontract is part of our direct cost. However, when you're looking at these detailed and modulars, they're only interested in the direct cost of the subcontracts too. So it's the direct cost of the whole project is what you're looking at to get that $250,000 ballpark. On the new master budget sheets that we have, there's a little purple block on the right, and that'll show you what the modular amounts are for direct cost. If you are working on a very extensive program of research and you're going to be needing over $500,000 in direct cost in any one budget period, then you have to have prior approval from NIH, and you're supposed to ask for this 6 weeks prior to the proposal being submitted. So you have to go to the program officer where you think it's going to be funded and get permission to have this large budget. If you or someone on your proposal exceeds the NIH salary cap, which is $199,300 on a 12-month appointment, or $149,472 on a 9-month appointment, then the amount over that cap is automatically cost shared. It's not income. It has to be tracked internally, but you don't get paid that any amount over what the cap is. It's a way that NIH has of reducing cost on research. So other things to consider for the budget, regardless of which type of budget you're doing for NIH, internally you will do the OU spreadsheet, and it is a detailed budget, and this is what routes. We will fill out the detailed budget or the modular budget form for you in the application package based on the parameters that we just talked about on the thresholds, or if the solicitation has a requirement. If you have a subcontract, the information that's loaded for them is going to be driven based on your budget total. So for example, if you have a modular budget, the only thing that's loaded for the subcontract is like a real short just personnel justification for them, and that's it. Now internally we still want the subcontract package because that gives us our commitment from them that they legally know that they're involved in the proposal. If on the other hand you have a detailed budget and you have a subcontract, then your subcontract also has to provide a detailed budget for us to upload. And it goes on a special R&R form that they have to give to us, because if they don't give us that form, then that means we have to manually load it, which is quite labor intensive, because each, like one form page of the budget takes 4 pages of entries to put it onto the NIH form. So that's how come we usually require, if you have a subcontract and it's a detailed budget, that they provide that form to us so that they fill out their own budget form for us and we just import it into the application. So some of the differences between the detailed and the modular: the detailed budget has line by line entries. So every PI and co-PI has to be listed with their base salary, their amount of effort, their fringe, and everything loaded. Every category of spending has it loaded. So it's somewhat similar to the detailed budget that OU routes, but they want more information, especially in the personnel area. And I mentioned before, if you have subcontracts, they have to provide a detailed budget too. If, on the other hand, your proposal qualifies for a modular budgets are in increments of 25,000. So for example, if you spent $85,000 in the first year, then we're going to do what's called a modular offset and plus you up to 100,000, because we can't use 85,000. We have to use either 75 or 100,000 because it has to be something dividable by 25,000. You can go, if you want to, instead of using the modular offset, and you can decide where you want that money to be spent exactly in the budget. That's up to you. On a modular budget, the budget justification is just personnel information. So how much effort is this person providing on the proposal? If you have a subcontract, they have what's called a consortium budget justification. And that's pretty much the personnel on the subcontract, just their information. If the modules differ, for example, in one year you have 200,000 and the next year you have 175, then you have to do, I think it's called an additional narrative justification that explains why the modules are different. And it doesn't have to be a long drawn out explanation, just something that says year one was 200,000, the next year was 175,000, and the difference was because we spent $25,000 in equipment in year one. So just something real simple. On a detailed budget, you will have to provide a detailed budget justification, just like the one that you use for routing. And your subcontracts also have to include a detailed budget justification with their R&R budget form too. So A subcontract is a person or organization that's substantially involved. They're going to be helping make programmatic decisions, and they'll usually co-author on any publications. A vendor is providing something that anyone could order something similar, like testing for a fee. A consultant is someone who's involved in a limited manner for a short time, like maybe just for a few weeks in the summer, or for a limited scope, like maybe they're just going to sit on an advisory board. Usually, a vendor or a consultant is not involved in making programmatic decisions, although a consultant might be involved in publications. And another thing to consider is just because you have a university involved doesn't mean that they're automatically a subcontract, because they could just be doing testing services for you. Just because someone was a vendor last time doesn't mean that they're a vendor this time, or because they were a subcontract last time doesn't mean they're a subcontract this time. It's the relationship that they have with you and the proposal that's being submitted that determines what they are. If you want to mark someone as a collaborator on their role, NIH usually considers that a collaborator is working for no budget consideration. However, I have seen that term broadly used for people that were on budgets and not, and I don't know that it has ever had remarks um, by any review people on it. If you have a subcontract, the routing paperwork that we need is the statement of work, the budget justification, the official letter of commitment from someone who can commit for the organization, and the negotiated rate agreement or a link to it. If you have a vendor, we don't need anything from them. If you have a quote from them, we recommend that you keep it so that at the time of award, you will hopefully not have a raise in the amount, because you can go back and say, well, here's the quote that you gave me. We recommend, if you have a consultant, that you obtain an email or a letter from them about what they're agreeing to do for you for this proposal and how much they're doing it for, or if they're doing it for free. We normally don't need these unless the specific solicitation asks for them, but it will help circumvent possible problems later if whoever is going to be your consultant forgets that they made these promises to you about doing the work for a certain amount of funds. When it comes to a subcontract, the submission paperwork that is needed is different. So for both a detailed and a modular submission, you might want to include performance site information. That's up to the PI if you want to include them or not. If they're a key person, then you're going to want their bio sketch. You might want a letter of support from them if they're external to OU. And we will still want the official subcontract package from them if they're a subcontract. If it's a detailed submission, you'll have to have a detailed budget justification from the subcontract, and you'll also have to have the R&R subcontract budget form. Some of the common things that we see that cause problems are questions that drove specific files, those files being missing. So for example, human subjects files not being loaded, or not having a multiple PI or PD leadership plan. And a lot of times we catch these before submission because we primarily use, Cayuse has a submission system that we use that does error checks before it goes into grants.gov. It's also not uncommon that we might see something about page limits being exceeded, especially if there's specific information in the solicitation that required unusual page limits. This link on the bottom goes to the standard page limits for the different sections. We also sometimes see some problems with formatting, where too small a font was used, or the person adjusted the kerneling or the spacing between the characters or the vertical inches. They no longer accept unusual paper sizes. So they want everything in standard letter paper size, and the margins should be a half an inch on all sides. If they give you a format template or information, then you're expected to follow those templates, and you're expected to make sure that they're current. Right now, there are formats or templates available for the BioSketch, for data tables, um, and certain other forms, many of which we will take care of as part of the application package, like the performance site. If you're going to be PDFing, which most of the files you submit should be in PDF format, they should not be password protected. File name should be kept 50 characters or less and should be unique within the application. So they don't want you to use the same file name twice. If you're uploading attachments, then you want to make sure that if there's more than one attachment, you call them something different, something that makes sense for what that attachment is. If you're going to use spaces between words or characters, they recommend that you only use one space and that you don't start a file name with a space. Um, Hyperlinks and URLs are only allowed if they're specifically noted. Like you can use them for citing publications, but you can't use them in the research strategy unless the solicitation says that you can. Don't use appendixes to circumvent page limits. Don't include headers and footers. Um, when the information loads into um, NIH, it adds the headers and footers to it. But they do recommend that you use section headers. So, for example, in your research strategy, when you're talking about your approach, you should start that section off under approach. Your takeaway, we would encourage you to become familiar with the general guidelines and make sure overall that you're using the most current guidelines. Try to decide what budget type you're going to be using as soon as possible. Um, Luckily, most of the time, this is prescribed by the type of solicitation you're going to be submitting for. But for example, if you're doing an R01, you could have a modular R01 or a detailed budget R01. So it helps to get that decision made as soon as you can. Send your PDS the information to fill out the forms in the application as soon as possible. Send your files as soon as possible so that we can see if they upload without any issues and that they display correctly once they get added to the application. Because we can send back print copies to you for you to look at to see if things look okay or not. NIH has a 2-day validation window. So once you do the submission, they hold it in a little holding queue for you to look at to see if everything transmitted right and all the pictures look like they're supposed to look like. So you can go back and change it before they finish the rest of the processing as they in-process it into NIH. But this window is only good before the due date. So if you submit the day of the deadline, your validation window expires at 5. So if you submitted at 2, then you only have a 3-hour validation window. So if you want to take advantage of the full validation window time, you've got to submit 2 days before the deadline. We would recommend that you do your ORCID, ERA Commons, and Science CV registrations. Some of those are more critical than others, but NIH has announced that they are going to go 100% ORCID compliant for all of their PIs sometime in the near future. It's being announced as solicitations come out. There will be something in the solicitation that says that you have to include your ORCID number. They have announced that effective January 22, everyone who is listed on your key personnel form has to have their ERA Commons account established. They have already announced that at some point in the future, possibly fiscal year 22 towards the end, they are going to be requiring using, I can't remember if it was BioSketches or other support forms from Science CV. So many of the federal agencies are going to the ORCID and the Science CV registrations to enable you to pull uh, BioSketch and Current and Pending from those two systems. Always recommend look at the NIH website. They have a lot of information available. They have like little webcasts you can look at. They have form examples. Um, they have a lot of FAQs, especially related to the biosketches and the other support forms because those are current hot topics. And so if you've got any questions about what to look at on those forms, I would be sure to look at the FAQs that are online. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me or you can contact RIS@ou.edu. Um, if you are pretty sure you're going to submit a proposal, go ahead and do your info sheet. And then the person who's going to be working with you will contact you and you can ask them any questions that you want. We work very closely with the Center for Faculty Excellence, and they also provide proposal assistance on sometimes helping review proposal content or providing template type information for some sections. They also do ORCID and Science CV training. If you have a question related to post-award, then the contact for that is Research Financial Services. And with that, that concludes our briefing. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions? Okay.